In a faraway kingdom, nestled between towering mountains and vast fields, life was anything but peaceful. The ruler of this land, King Aldrich, was known for his cold heart and unyielding grip on power. His soldiers, the royal guards, were feared more than respected. They wore uniforms that shimmered with gold embroidery, symbols of their authority, but to the common folk, those clothes represented oppression and cruelty. Every day, people lived in dread, never knowing when the guards might appear to impose harsh taxes or punish them for minor offenses. Among these villagers was a man named Elias. He wasn't extraordinary by any means. He was just an ordinary blacksmith who spent most of his days hammering away at glowing pieces of metal in his small workshop. But Elias had something many others lacked: a deep sense of justice. He hated seeing how the guards treated the poor, especially since he himself had once been on the receiving end of their brutality. Years ago, they had taken away his father over a misunderstanding, leaving young Elias alone to fend for himself. That memory still burned inside him like hot coals. The village where Elias lived was always tense. On one side, there were farmers struggling to grow crops under heavy taxation, and on the other, merchants trying desperately to make ends meet while paying bribes to avoid trouble. Children played quietly, afraid even to laugh too loudly lest it draw unwanted attention from patrolling guards. It felt as though fear had seeped into every corner of their lives. One fateful morning, Elias witnessed something that broke what little patience he had left. As he walked through the marketplace carrying tools for repair work, he saw a group of guards surrounding a young boy. The child, no older than 10, clutched a loaf of bread tightly to his chest. Tears streamed down his face as one of the guards shouted accusations of theft. Without hesitation, the guard raised his baton and struck the boy hard across the back, causing him to crumple to the ground. The crowd froze, too frightened to intervene. Elias couldn't move either, not because of fear, but because anger rooted him to the spot. His fists clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. How could anyone justify such cruelty? What kind of system allowed men dressed in fancy uniforms to act like monsters? For hours afterward, images of the boy's tear-streaked face haunted him. That night, unable to sleep, Elias sat by the fire in his modest home, staring into the flickering flames. An idea began forming in his mind. An idea so bold, so dangerous, that it made his heart race just thinking about it. He thought about the royal guards' uniforms, those glittering symbols of tyranny. What if he could destroy them publicly, right in front of everyone? What message would that send? Would it inspire others to rise up, or would it only lead to disaster? Tossing and turning in bed, Elias wrestled with doubt and determination. By dawn, however, his resolve hardened. If nothing changed, then life in the kingdom would remain unbearable. For him, for the boy, and for countless others crushed beneath the weight of injustice. Something had to be done, and Elias decided it was going to start with him. Elias knew that simply being angry wasn't enough. If he wanted to make a difference, he needed a plan, a bold one that would shake the foundation of fear gripping the kingdom. But as much as his heart burned with determination, he also understood the risks. Burning the royal guard uniforms in public was no small act. It was an open challenge to the king's authority. Such defiance could easily cost him his life. Yet the more Elias thought about it, the more convinced he became that this was the spark the people needed to wake up from their silence. The first step was gathering support. Over the next few weeks, Elias began talking to villagers during his visits to repair tools or deliver orders. At first, he kept his tone casual, sharing stories of other places where ordinary people had stood up against tyrants. "Did you hear about the farmers in the Northern Valley?" he'd ask while hammering away at a horseshoe. They refused to pay unfair taxes and eventually forced the Lord to listen. Some nodded thoughtfully, intrigued by the idea of resistance, but most looked away nervously. Fear still held them tightly in its grasp. One evening, Elias approached old Martha, a wise woman who ran the village bakery. She had seen decades of oppression and often whispered her discontent to trusted friends. Sitting beside her warm oven, Elias shared his thoughts. "Martha," he said quietly, "what if we showed everyone that the guards aren't untouchable? What if we proved they're just men hiding behind shiny uniforms?" Martha hesitated, her wrinkled hands kneading dough. Finally, she sighed. "It's dangerous, Elias. People are scared, not just of the guards, but of what comes after. Change is hard to trust." Her words stayed with Elias long after their conversation ended. He realized that inspiring courage wasn't just about action. It was about symbolism. The uniforms represented everything wrong with the kingdom: greed, cruelty, and arrogance. Destroying them publicly would send a clear message that the power of the oppressors wasn't absolute. Still, he couldn't do it alone. He needed the crowd on his side when the moment came. To prepare, Elias started collecting materials discreetly. Late at night, when the streets were empty, he scavenged scraps of oil-soaked rags and bits of kindling. In his workshop, he fashioned a simple torch, wrapping a piece of cloth around a sturdy stick. Each step filled him with both excitement and dread. He imagined the faces of the villagers, their shock, their hope, perhaps even their cheers, as the uniforms turned to ash. But he also pictured the guards' fury, their swords flashing in the sunlight as they tried to stop him. As the days passed, Elias grew restless. He chose the weekly market day for his plan, knowing it would draw the largest crowd. On that day, the square buzzed with activity, packed with merchants selling fruits, fabrics, and spices. The air smelled of roasted nuts and fresh bread. It was the perfect backdrop, a place alive with energy, yet weighed down by invisible chains of fear. Elias rehearsed his words over and over in his mind, practicing how he would address the crowd once the deed was done. He wanted his voice to ring out loud and clear, cutting through years of silence. Finally, the morning arrived. As Elias made his way to the marketplace, his heart pounded like a drum. Hidden beneath his cloak was the torch, ready to ignite not just fabric, but a movement. He scanned the area, noting the guards patrolling lazily near the barracks where their uniforms hung drying outside. Everything depended on timing. One wrong move, and it could all fall apart. Taking a deep breath, Elias reminded himself why he was doing this. For the boy beaten in the street, for the family struggling to survive, and for every person too afraid to dream of a better life. Standing amidst the bustling crowd, Elias felt a strange mix of calm and adrenaline. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for. All eyes would soon be on him, and whether it ended in triumph or tragedy, there was no turning back now. Elias's plan was simple in theory, but carrying it out required precision and nerves of steel. He spent days observing the guards' routines, noting when they changed shifts, how often they inspected their uniforms, and where exactly those uniforms were left to dry after washing. It wasn't easy. Any slip-up could draw suspicion, and Elias knew that being caught before he even acted would mean disaster. Every step had to be calculated, every detail accounted for. The first challenge was timing. The Royal Guards' uniforms were only hung outside once a week on laundry day, which coincided with the busy market day. This worked in Elias's favor. There would be plenty of distractions in the crowded square, but it also meant he'd have less room to maneuver without drawing attention. He decided that noon would be the perfect moment. By then, the sun would be high, ensuring the uniforms were still damp enough to catch fire easily, and the marketplace would be at its liveliest. People would be too preoccupied with shopping or chatting to notice him until it was too late. Next came the materials. Elias didn't want to rely on luck. He needed something reliable to ignite the uniforms quickly and efficiently. Late one night, under the cover of darkness, he snuck into his workshop and began crafting a small makeshift torch. Using scraps of oil-soaked cloth wrapped tightly around a sturdy wooden stick, he created something both practical and inconspicuous. To test it, he lit the torch briefly in the privacy of his forge, watching as flames licked hungrily at the fabric. Satisfied with his creation, He hid it carefully beneath a pile of tools, knowing it would remain safe until the big day. But preparation wasn't just about physical tools. It was also mental. Elias rehearsed what he would say to the crowd over and over again in his mind. He wanted his words to resonate deeply, to cut through years of fear and apathy. "These uniforms represent your suffering," he practiced whispering to himself while hammering horseshoes during the day. "When they burn, so does the king's power over us." He repeated these phrases like a mantra, hoping they would come naturally when the time came. As the chosen day approached, Elias grew increasingly anxious. What if someone noticed him acting strangely? What if the guards sensed his intentions? To avoid raising suspicion, he went about his daily routine as usual, repairing tools and delivering orders with a calm demeanor. Inside, however, his thoughts raced. At night, sleep eluded him, and he found himself staring at the ceiling, imagining all possible outcomes. Would the crowd cheer for him? Or would they scatter in terror? Would the guards arrest him immediately? Or would chaos erupt? On the morning of the market day, Elias woke before sunrise. His hands trembled slightly as he dressed in his plain blacksmith's tunic, deliberately avoiding anything that might make him stand out. After securing the torch beneath his cloak, he took a deep breath and stepped outside. The air was crisp, filled with the faint scent of dew-covered grass. As he walked toward the marketplace, he reminded himself of why he was doing this. For the boy beaten in the street, for old Martha's quiet defiance, for everyone who had suffered silently for too long. Reaching the square, Elias positioned himself near the barracks, blending into the throng of villagers browsing stalls. From this vantage point, he could see the line of drying uniforms swaying gently in the breeze. They gleamed faintly in the sunlight, their golden embroidery mocking him. Each glance at them fueled his determination. He waited patiently, biding his time, his fingers brushing against the hidden torch beneath his cloak. Minutes felt like hours as the clock ticked closer to noon. Around him, life carried on as usual. Merchants shouted prices, children laughed, and chickens clucked noisily in crates. But Elias barely registered any of it. His focus was razor-sharp, his senses attuned to every movement nearby. When the church bells chimed 12 times, signaling midday, Elias straightened up, his heart pounding like a war drum. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for. With slow, deliberate steps, he moved closer to the uniforms, his hand gripping the torch tightly. There was no turning back now. As the church bells tolled 12 times, signaling the arrival of noon, Elias felt time slow down. The noise of the bustling marketplace seemed to fade into a distant hum, replaced by the thunderous rhythm of his own heartbeat. His hand tightened around the torch hidden beneath his cloak as he took deliberate steps toward the line of drying uniforms, swaying gently in the breeze. Each movement felt like it carried the weight of destiny, and every second stretched endlessly before him. The guards were nearby, chatting idly among themselves, their polished armor glinting under the midday sun. They paid little attention to the villagers or the uniforms hanging just a few paces away. After all, who would dare touch something so sacred? Their arrogance was exactly what Elias had counted on. He moved closer, his breathing steady despite the storm raging inside him. When he reached the edge of the crowd near the barracks, he paused for a moment, scanning the scene one last time. The uniforms shimmered mockingly, symbols of everything wrong with the kingdom. It was now or never. With a deep breath, Elias pulled the torch from beneath his cloak and struck the flint against its tip. A small spark flickered hesitantly at first, but soon flames erupted, licking hungrily at the oil-soaked cloth wrapped around the stick. Gasps rippled through the nearest onlookers as they turned to see what was happening. For a brief moment, silence fell over the square, broken only by the crackling sound of the fire. Then, without hesitation, Elias stepped forward and thrust the torch onto the nearest uniform. The fabric caught almost instantly, the dampness doing little to slow the hungry flames. Within seconds, bright orange tongues devoured the golden embroidery, turning the once proud symbol of authority into blackened ash. The sight was mesmerizing, horrifying, and liberating all at once. People froze, their eyes wide with shock, unsure whether to cheer, run, or scream. Some clapped instinctively, emboldened by the sheer audacity of the act, while others recoiled in fear. Certain retribution would follow. Elias stood tall amidst the chaos, his chest heaving as adrenaline coursed through him. He raised his voice above the growing murmurs, shouting words that rang out like a battle cry. These clothes are not just fabric. They are chains. Chains that bind you, your families, and your future. His voice echoed across the square, raw and powerful. When we burn them, we burn the fear they stand for. Today, we take back our dignity. His words ignited something in the crowd. Slowly, hesitant cheers began to rise, mingling with shouts of encouragement. But not everyone reacted positively. The guards, finally realizing what was happening, spun around with fury etched onto their faces. One of them barked orders, drawing his sword as he lunged toward Elias. Panic spread like wildfire, and some villagers scattered, tripping over each other in their haste to escape. Others, however, formed a protective barrier around Elias, unwilling to let the guards reach him so easily. The guards pushed through the throng, shoving people aside as they closed in. Their weapons gleamed menacingly, but Elias didn't flinch. Instead, he held his ground, staring defiantly at the approaching soldiers. "Go ahead," he challenged, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Strike me down if you must. But know this, you can kill me, but you cannot kill the truth I set free today." For a moment, it seemed as though the guards would cut him down where he stood. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Then, just as one of the guards raised his blade, a new voice sliced through the commotion. A commanding yet unfamiliar tone that stopped everyone in their tracks. "Enough," it boomed, echoing across the square with authority. All eyes turned toward the source, and Elias braced himself, wondering who could possibly intervene at such a critical moment. The voice that rang out across the square was sharp and commanding, slicing through the chaos like a blade. Everyone froze. Guards, villagers, and Elias alike, all turning their heads to see who had spoken. From the edge of the crowd emerged Lady Seraphina, the king's estranged niece. Though she rarely appeared in public, her presence was unmistakable. She carried herself with quiet dignity, her posture straight and regal despite her simple traveling cloak. Her piercing gaze swept over the scene, taking in the burning uniforms, the terrified villagers, and the guards poised to strike. For a moment, there was complete silence. Even the guards hesitated, their weapons still raised but unmoving. It wasn't just her title that gave her authority. It was the look in her eyes, a mixture of anger and resolve that demanded attention. Lady Seraphina stepped forward calmly, her boots crunching softly against the cobblestones as she approached the center of the square. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a path for her. As she drew closer, Elias noticed something unusual about her expression. It wasn't disdain or judgment he saw, but understanding, a shared frustration with the injustice they all lived under. "Enough bloodshed," she declared firmly, her voice carrying effortlessly over the murmurs of the crowd. She turned to face the guards, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Put your swords down. This moment has gone far beyond you." Her words were met with stunned silence from the soldiers, who exchanged uncertain glances. They were accustomed to following orders without question, but this situation was different. Attacking nobility, even one as distant as Lady Seraphina, was unthinkable. Slowly, reluctantly, they lowered their weapons, though their scowls made it clear they weren't happy about it. Lady Seraphina then turned to address the crowd, her demeanor softening slightly. "You have suffered long enough under my uncle's rule," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I have seen the cruelty, the greed, the pain inflicted upon innocent people, and I will not stand by while it continues." Her declaration sent ripples through the gathered villagers. Some began to whisper excitedly, daring to hope that this unexpected ally might truly help them. Others remained cautious, unsure whether to trust someone tied to the royal family. Elias watched her closely, his initial shock giving way to cautious optimism. He had expected punishment, arrest, or worse when the guards cornered him. But instead, here was a member of the royal family siding with the oppressed. It was almost too good to be true. Lady Seraphina locked eyes with him briefly, offering a small nod of acknowledgement before addressing the crowd again. "What this man has done today is more than an act of defiance," she continued. "It is a call to action. Will you answer it?" Her words ignited a spark in the villagers. Cheers erupted once more, louder and bolder this time. People began chanting, their voices rising together in unity. Freedom, justice. The energy in the square shifted dramatically, transforming fear into courage and despair into determination. Lady Seraphina raised her hands to quiet them, her expression grave yet hopeful. "But remember this," she warned. "Change will not come easily. There will be sacrifices, struggles, and hardships ahead. Are you prepared to fight, not with violence, but with resilience, for a better future?" The crowd responded with resounding agreement, their shouts echoing off the stone walls of the surrounding buildings. For the first time in years, they felt a sense of empowerment, as if the chains of oppression were beginning to loosen. Elias stood quietly amidst the commotion, overwhelmed by what had transpired. He hadn't planned for this turn of events, but he couldn't deny the significance of it. Lady Seraphina's intervention had elevated his solitary act of rebellion into something much larger, a movement fueled by collective hope. As the guards reluctantly retreated, muttering angrily among themselves, Lady Seraphina turned back to Elias. "You've started something extraordinary," she said softly, so only he could hear. "But now we must work together to ensure it doesn't end here." Elias nodded, his resolve strengthening. Whatever lay ahead, he knew he wouldn't face it alone. With Lady Seraphina's unexpected support, Elias found himself thrust into a role he had never imagined for himself. Overnight, he became the face of a growing rebellion, a symbol of hope for those who had long suffered under the king's oppressive rule. News of the burning uniforms spread like wildfire, carried by travelers and whispered in taverns across the kingdom. Villagers from neighboring towns began arriving, eager to join the cause. They brought stories of their own struggles, of crops seized, homes destroyed, and loved ones taken, and each tale fueled the fire of determination within the movement. Lady Seraphina proved to be an invaluable ally. Unlike her uncle, she possessed a deep sense of compassion and justice, traits that had made her an outcast at court. She used her knowledge of the royal family's inner workings to guide the rebellion strategically. Under her leadership, the group organized protests, distributed pamphlets denouncing the king's cruelty, and even sabotaged key supply routes that kept the palace running smoothly. Her presence gave legitimacy to their efforts, drawing in not only peasants but also disillusioned merchants, former soldiers, and even a few low-ranking officials who had grown tired of serving a corrupt regime. Elias, though initially hesitant to lead, soon discovered his natural ability to inspire others. Standing on makeshift platforms in village squares, or addressing crowds gathered near riversides, he spoke with a passion that resonated deeply. "We are not just fighting against uniforms or swords," he would say, his voice ringing clear and strong. "We are fighting for our children's futures, for a world where no one has to live in fear." His words struck a chord, igniting courage in hearts that had been burdened by years of silence. People began seeing him not as a simple blacksmith, but as a leader capable of guiding them toward freedom. The movement gained momentum rapidly, but it wasn't without challenges. The king, enraged by the defiance spreading through his kingdom, ordered harsh crackdowns. Soldiers were dispatched to villages suspected of supporting the rebellion, often leaving destruction in their wake. Homes were burned, livestock slaughtered, and anyone caught distributing pamphlets was arrested, or worse. Yet, instead of quelling the uprising, these brutal tactics only strengthened the people's resolve. "They think fear will stop us," Elias said during one particularly fiery speech after a village was razed. But they've forgotten something. When you take everything from someone, there's nothing left to lose. Lady Serafina played a crucial role in countering the king's aggression. Using her connections, she managed to smuggle food and supplies to affected communities, ensuring they could rebuild and continue resisting. She also worked tirelessly to win over influential figures, including wealthy landowners and clergy members who had previously remained neutral. By appealing to their sense of morality, and sometimes offering promises of reform, she secured vital resources and support for the cause. Her diplomatic skills complemented Elias's fiery speeches, creating a balance between inspiration and strategy. As weeks turned into months, cracks began to form in the foundation of the king's power. Some guards defected, unwilling to carry out orders they deemed unjust. Others secretly aided the rebels, providing information about troop movements or weak points in the palace defenses. Even within the nobility, whispers of dissent grew louder. Many lords and ladies, once loyal to King Aldrich, began questioning his leadership, especially as tales of his cruelty reached their ears. The tide was turning, and everyone could feel it. Through it all, Elias and Lady Serafina stood side by side, united by a shared vision of a better future. They spent countless nights planning their next moves, debating strategies, and comforting those who had lost loved ones in the struggle. Though exhaustion weighed heavily on them both, their spirits remained unbroken. "This isn't just about overthrowing a king," Serafina reminded Elias one evening as they sat beneath the stars. "It's about building something new, something fair and just. That's why we can't give up." And so, the rebellion pressed on, driven by hope, resilience, and the belief that change was possible. What started as a single act of defiance had blossomed into a nationwide movement, one that refused to be silenced. The king's grip on the kingdom was slipping, and the people knew it. For the first time in generations, they allowed themselves to dream of a brighter tomorrow, a dream worth fighting for. The rebellion, once a flicker of defiance, had grown into an unstoppable wildfire. Villages that were once cowed by fear now stood tall, their people united under the banner of change. Lady Serafina and Elias worked tirelessly to channel this newfound courage into organized action. They knew that defeating King Aldrich wouldn't be easy. He still commanded a formidable army, loyal nobles, and vast resources. But they also understood that his greatest weakness was his arrogance. The king refused to believe that ordinary people could overthrow him, dismissing their uprising as mere chaos. Under Serafina's guidance, the rebels began targeting symbols of the monarchy's power. Tax records were burned, freeing villagers from crippling debts. Granaries controlled by corrupt officials were seized, and food was distributed among the starving. Bridges connecting royal supply lines were sabotaged, cutting off reinforcements and supplies to the palace. Each victory, no matter how small, emboldened the people further. Stories of triumph spread like ripples across a pond, inspiring even the most reluctant to join the cause. Elias traveled from village to village, rallying supporters and sharing news of their progress. His speeches became legendary, blending fiery passion with heartfelt sincerity. "This isn't just about us," he would say, pointing to the scars on his hands from years of labor. "It's about every man, woman, and child who deserves to live without fear. Together, we can rewrite our story." Crowds cheered wildly, their voices rising in unison as they chanted slogans born out of hope. Unity, justice, freedom. Meanwhile, Lady Serafina focused on dismantling the monarchy's inner circle. She reached out to disillusioned members of the court, offering them amnesty if they turned against the king. Many accepted, seeing the writing on the wall. A few high-ranking generals defected, bringing valuable knowledge of military strategies and weaknesses within the royal forces. Others quietly funneled information to the rebels, ensuring they stayed one step ahead of the king's envoys. But the road to victory was far from smooth. There were setbacks. villages attacked by loyalist troops, spies uncovered within the rebel ranks, and moments when hope seemed fleeting. One particularly devastating blow came when a trusted ally was captured and executed publicly as a warning to others. The loss shook everyone deeply, including Elias, who had grown close to the man. For days, doubt lingered in the air, threatening to undo all they had accomplished. It was during this dark time that Serafina reminded them of their purpose. "We mourn those we've lost, but we honor them by continuing the fight," she said firmly. "Every life taken strengthens our resolve. We will not let their sacrifices be in vain." Slowly, the movement regained its footing. Inspired by Serafina's words, the rebels struck back harder than ever. In one daring raid, they infiltrated a heavily guarded armory, seizing weapons and armor to equip themselves for future battles. In another, they ambushed a convoy carrying gold meant to fund the king's mercenaries, redistributing the wealth among impoverished towns. Each success chipped away at the king's authority, leaving him increasingly isolated. As months passed, cracks widened not only in the kingdom's infrastructure, but also in the loyalty of those closest to the throne. Courtiers whispered behind closed doors, plotting ways to distance themselves from the doomed ruler. Merchants stopped paying taxes, knowing the king's days were numbered. Even some clergy spoke out against him, declaring his reign unjust and calling for reform. The tide had turned irrevocably, and there was no going back. Through it all, Elias and Serafina remained steadfast, their bond growing stronger with each challenge they faced. Late at night, after long days of strategizing and rallying, they would sit together, talking quietly about what kind of kingdom they wanted to build. "It won't be perfect," Elias admitted one evening, staring at the stars. "But it'll be better. That's enough for me." Serafina smiled softly, her eyes reflecting the same quiet determination. Better is all we need. By the time winter arrived, the rebellion had reached the palace gates. The once mighty fortress now stood surrounded by a sea of torches, carried by thousands of determined citizens. Inside, King Aldrich paced furiously, his confidence shattered. He had underestimated the strength of unity, the resilience of those he sought to oppress. And as dawn broke over the horizon, signaling the final battle, the people prepared to claim the freedom they had fought so hard to achieve. The final battle for the kingdom began at sunrise as golden light spilled over the snow-covered fields surrounding the palace. The air was crisp and cold, but the spirits of the rebels burned hotter than ever. Thousands of villagers, armed with makeshift weapons, farm tools, and salvaged swords, stood united outside the towering gates of the fortress. Torchlight flickered against their determined faces, illuminating a sea of hope that stretched as far as the eye could see. Among them were blacksmiths, farmers, merchants, and even former guards who had abandoned their posts in disgust. They were no longer just individuals. They were a single force driven by one shared dream: freedom. Inside the palace walls, King Aldrich was unraveling. Once proud and unshakable, he now paced frantically through his grand halls, shouting orders that went largely ignored. His remaining loyalists cowered in fear, knowing the end was near. The king's arrogance had blinded him to the strength of unity, and now his isolation left him powerless. When the first wave of rebels breached the gates, it wasn't with brute force, but with sheer numbers and unwavering resolve. The sound of crashing metal and cheering voices echoed through the corridors, signaling the collapse of tyranny. Elias led the charge alongside Lady Serafina, both clad not in armor, but in simple tunics, symbols of their solidarity with the people. As they entered the throne room, they found the king seated on his gilded chair, clutching his scepter like a child clinging to a broken toy. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he tried to maintain some semblance of authority. "You dare defy your king," he spat, his voice cracking under the weight of his own fear. Elias stepped forward, meeting the man's gaze without flinching. "You stopped being our king the day you chose greed over justice," he replied firmly. "Your reign ends here." With those words, the rebels surged forward, overwhelming the last remnants of resistance. The king was dragged from his throne, his cries of indignation drowned out by the triumphant shouts of the crowd. Justice was swift and decisive. Aldrich was stripped of his title and imprisoned, his wealth redistributed to rebuild what years of oppression had destroyed. It was a moment of closure, not just for Elias, but for everyone who had suffered under the old regime. In the days that followed, Lady Seraphina took her place as regent, vowing to lead with fairness and compassion. She called for a council made up of representatives from every corner of the kingdom, farmers, scholars, merchants, and laborers alike, to help shape the new laws. Together, they worked to dismantle the systems of exploitation that had plagued the land for generations. Taxes were reformed, education became accessible to all, and protections were put in place to ensure no one would ever again endure the hardships faced under the previous rule. Elias returned to his village, though he remained deeply involved in the rebuilding efforts. He continued to speak at gatherings, sharing stories of resilience and reminding people of how far they had come. Yet he refused any titles or rewards, insisting that leadership belonged to everyone equally. "I'm just a blacksmith," he said humbly during one such speech. "But together, we proved that even ordinary people can change the world." As spring arrived, melting away the winter frost, the kingdom began to heal. Fields once barren were planted anew, homes destroyed by violence were rebuilt, and laughter returned to villages where silence had lingered for too long. Though scars remained, both physical and emotional, the people carried them proudly as reminders of their strength. Lady Seraphina often visited Elias in his workshop, watching as sparks flew from his hammer against glowing metal. "You started this," she said one afternoon, smiling softly. "But it's theirs now, their future." Elias nodded, looking out at the bustling square beyond his door. Children played freely, vendors called out cheerfully, and neighbors greeted each other warmly. It was a scene he had once only dreamed of, a testament to the power of courage, unity, and hope. And so, the kingdom moved forward, forever changed by the actions of one man who dared to set fire to the symbols of oppression. What began as an act of defiance grew into a movement that reshaped an entire nation. In the hearts of its people, the memory of Elias's bravery lived on, a reminder that even in the darkest times, a single spark can ignite a brighter tomorrow.